Wow, we're up to 41 participants. Thank you all for coming. That's what we like to see. Let's give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Yes, good question. It will be available, recording and transcript after the webinar. It will be on the ARP website and on the YouTube channel. No problem. Okay, time. Okay, 102 Pacific. We got 49. It's exciting. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and people can trickle in as they do. Okay, my name's Ben Negro. Great to see you all here. Really excited. I would like to welcome you to the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health, April 2024 ARP webinar. This webinar is titled An Introduction to Plain Language Writing for Academics and Researchers, and is presented by Zoe Gross. Thank you for joining. Because of the number of participants, which is really great, your audio will be muted throughout the call, but you can submit questions at any point during the presentation via the Q&A feature or just in the chat box if that's easier. Friendly reminder, please be respectful when communicating in the chat and asking questions. And note that only questions or comments pertaining to the presentation will be addressed. This entire webinar is being recorded, and as I mentioned, will be available on the ARP website. I will put that in the chat right now. You may also view the presenter slides and follow along with the presentation in our Google Drive archive. I'll also put that in the chat. And at the end, there'll be a short evaluation survey. We invite you to provide feedback on the webinar. We really value that, as well as suggestions for future webinars, maybe speakers, maybe topics, really whatever, wherever you feel we should know. Okay, so we're at 103. Let's get started. Zoe, if you don't mind sharing the screen for the slides, let me know if you're having trouble with that.
Yes, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So you'll need to set it from like only host can share the screen to anyone can share the screen or multiple participants can share the screen.
Gotcha. Try it again now.
Yes, now I can do it.
Okay, probably. Yeah, that would be bad if the presenter couldn't share the screen.
All right, folks should be able to see my screen now. Thank you all so much for coming. Today I'll be talking about plain language for academics and researchers. As Ben said, if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat or the Q&A. I can't always see those things, but we'll be trying to check on them throughout the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Ben for this disclaimer language.
Super briefly, we just want to acknowledge the Health Resources and Services Administration as the funding source for ARP. And Zoe will keep going now.
All right, thank you. Okay, so getting started with what is plain language and why is it important? Plain language is a cognitively accessible style of writing. When I say cognitive accessibility, what I mean is writing that is easily understandable by anybody, including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Plain language is important because people with disabilities should have equal access to information. And plain language can give people equal access to information, even if that information is very complex or very technical in nature. So ASAN has written about topics like how Medicaid works or what the federal budget process is, and been able to get down to a 4th grade reading level when addressing those topics and present them in plain language. Plain language goes a little beyond reading level and includes other features. I'll get into all of those. But the important takeaway here is you can talk about complex things using simple language. Ideally, everything would be available in plain language and cognitively accessible formats, but it's especially important that when content involves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that content is available in formats that everyone or as many people as possible can access. And remember, nothing about us without us. So we want the people being discussed to be able to access all of these conversations. Plain language writing is a skill of unlearning. So a lot of us have learned to incorporate cognitively inaccessible ways of writing into our work. In school, we may have learned to be more wordy in order to hit word counts for essays or papers. Working in academia, it may be that writing in a more formal way sounds more credible and professional than writing in a less formal way. So if you were to say it's really hard to do, people might think not take you as seriously as if you said this is a difficult series of tasks, just as an example. So we have kind of been set up to write in ways that aren't cognitively accessible. But we can unlearn that and start writing in ways that are more accessible to more people. And like all skills, you can work on and improve your plain language. And I'm going to get into the principles of plain language and where you can start. What are going to be your guiding points when you start to write in plain language? So what are the features of plain language? Just to give you an overview, some of the features of plain language are shorter sentences and paragraphs, more common words and fewer unusual words, giving definitions for important complex terms and jargon, using examples to help readers understand ideas, avoiding unnecessary information, using clear and straightforward language, and using active voice instead of passive voice. For every feature that I talk about, I'm going to give you the guidelines. So what's the rule? The reason why we follow that rule, tips for how to follow the rule, an example for what this looks like in practice, and then together we'll do an activity and try to apply the rule to a passage of text that I've written up. So let's start with our first guideline, shorter sentences and paragraphs. The rule here is that sentences should be 10 to 15 words long or shorter. Paragraphs should be 5 to 7 sentences or fewer. The reason here is that longer sentences and paragraphs can be inaccessible to some readers, and people can lose track of the point of the sentence or paragraph by the time they get to the end. Ways to do this, you can look for parts of the sentence that are set off by punctuation, like commas, parentheses, or dashes. You can often break up the sentence at the punctuation and turn it into multiple sentences using that as a guiding point. You can also use for joining words like and. When you say and, you might think, if this is a long sentence, but it's got an and in it, can I break it off at the and turn it into 2 sentences? Or look for phrases that you can shorten. For example, instead of saying due to the fact that, you could just say because. Here's an example of breaking a sentence into shorter sentences and paragraphs. Here we have written, Bob usually ate breakfast. That morning, he chose to skip breakfast because he knew he'd end up being late for his doctor's appointment if he took too long. That's a 28-word sentence, so much too long. We're going to break that into multiple sentences. Now it says, Bob usually eats breakfast in the morning. That morning, Bob chose not to have breakfast. Bob skipped breakfast so he could make it to his doctor's appointment on time. So that is 3 sentences, and the longest one is 14 words. So many fewer words per sentence than in the first iteration of this writing. We did several things here. We used punctuation as a guide to break things up, and looked for connecting words. Here we say because he knew he'd end up late for his doctor's appointment in the first example, and then in the second example that turns into he skipped breakfast so he could. So breaking it up there. All right, let's do an activity together. I'm going to read you a very long sentence, 53 words. There are 77 community areas, also known as neighborhoods, in the city of Chicago, including Little Village, a predominantly Mexican area on the west side of the city, Hyde Park, the home of the University of Chicago on the south side, and Rogers Park, the furthest area to the north of the city. So can I just get some folks in the chat to suggest ways that we could start breaking this into multiple shorter sentences? Jamie says, make the places a list. Hannah says, start with the sentence, there are 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. Eliana says, start a new paragraph with each of the places. Marissa says, look for breaks in punctuation. Got a couple of people suggesting we start with the sentence, there are 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. All great suggestions. So what we ended up doing using all of those ways of breaking down sentences is we rewrote this to say there are 77 community areas in Chicago. The community areas are also known as neighborhoods. One of the neighborhoods is Little Village. Little Village is a mostly Mexican neighborhood. It's on the west side of Chicago. Another neighborhood is Hyde Park. Hyde Park is on the south side. Hyde Park is where the University of Chicago is. Another neighborhood is Rogers Park. Rogers Park is the neighborhood furthest to the north of the city. So we took that 53-word sentence and we broke it down into many, many sentences, none of which have more than 8 words. So a win for making sentences shorter. The next guideline I'm going to talk about is using more common words. The reason for this is that using common words makes it more likely that your reader will understand what you're saying without having to look up something that you're saying. And when a reader has to look up or ask someone, what does this word mean? It interrupts their focus and it makes the reading comprehension more difficult. Tips for using more common words. If you're stuck on a complicated word and you can't figure out a simpler word that you can swap in, you can try using the thesaurus to find different words that mean the same thing. Also be on the lookout for simple ideas that are explained in a roundabout way or using complicated words. Saying the outside top part of a house doesn't use complicated words, but it's much easier to just say roof instead. Some examples of using more common words. Instead of saying the task is laborious, you could say the task is difficult. Instead of saying his glasses have convex lenses, you could say his glasses have lenses that curve outwards. This is an example of one where there isn't one word you can swap in for convex, but you can use other common words, multiple words, to explain what it means. And then instead of saying I'll attempt to assist her, you could say I'll try to help her. All right, let's try together an activity on using more common words. So this says, Sam was cognizant of the fact that her place of employment necessitated that she arrive punctually. If by happenstance she experienced a belated arrival, she could get penalized. So can I get some suggestions in the chat of words we can swap out here, words that are more uncommon that we can trade for more common words? Jamie says Sam knew instead of was cognizant. Dawn says you could say aware instead of cognizant. Eliana says needed instead of necessitated. Denise says take out happenstance. Daniela says maybe use aware instead of cognizant. Hannah has rewritten Sam knew she had to get to work on time. She would get in trouble if she was late. Susan Marie also, Sam knew she needed to get to work on time. Jordan Moore says Sam knew she was expected to arrive at work on time. If she was late, she could be punished. If by happenstance could just be if. Late instead of belated. Penalized, say in trouble instead. Take out of the fact. All right, we've got a lot of great suggestions here. So I think you've basically identified all of the places where we ended up swapping out words. We changed this to Sam knew that she needed to get to work on time. If she happened to get to work late, she could get in trouble. And folks have pointed out we could actually take out happened here and just say if she got to work late, she could get in trouble. So you've gone one further than we did. So great job. The third principle I'm going to talk about is giving definitions for important and complex terms and jargon. There are going to be times when you're writing something in plain language where there's a complex term that you want to leave in for your readers. An example of that might be if, let's say I'm writing about the federal budget. I need people to know the phrase appropriations committee. Those are both unusual words, but if you don't know the phrase appropriations committee, it's not going to make sense to you when other people talk about the budget process because people are going to be mentioning appropriations committee a lot. So what you're going to have to do is give an example and define the term that you are leaving in so that people don't need to go to a dictionary to learn what it means, and they don't like give up because they've been given a really weird term and no way to understand it. The way to understand it is right there in your writing. You have explained it for them. Tips for definitions. The definition should come right after the first time you use a complex term. You don't have to repeat the definition every time you use the term after that, although if you go a very long time between uses of the term, it can be helpful to add in a reminder. It's okay if your definition is multiple sentences. And if your term has multiple meanings, you don't have to define like every possible meaning of the term. You just have to define what it means in your document. Here's an example of giving definitions. I have written here, you should avoid using jargon unless it's an important specific word or phrase that the reader needs to understand. Jargon means complex technical wording that only certain groups would automatically understand. An example of jargon would be lawyers using terms like res judicata or a priori. All right. Here is an example of giving definitions for complex terms. So this is from one of ASAN's toolkits. We have written some people with disabilities live in institutions. There are many things about institutions that we wanted to put into this definition. So what we ended up writing was some people with disabilities live in institutions. Institutions are places where a lot of disabled people live. Institutions are run by the people who work there, not by the people living there. People living in institutions usually can't leave when they want to or spend their free time how they want to. So that was just us providing the context that we felt like people needed to understand the rest of the document. The fourth guideline I want to get into is using examples. So when you explain an idea that readers might not have experience with, you can like talk about a fictional person going through a process or in a certain situation to illustrate the idea. We find it most helpful to write this in the third person rather than in the second person. It helps people understand the idea by showing someone actually going through something, and like it can help you illustrate what the steps of a process might be, making ideas more concrete instead of abstract. Tips to use examples. Make sure your examples are clearly illustrating the situation you're describing, giving enough detail. For example, instead of saying you could order food for delivery, in a third person example, you could say Janet calls a local restaurant. She orders the pizza for delivery. The restaurant will bring the pizza to Janet's house. Here's another example of using examples. Let's say we're talking about homelessness. We might say something like, if you were homeless, you might try to call the local shelter, but they might not have a bed for you. In a more expanded third person example, that would look like Jim is homeless. He does not know where he can sleep tonight. He tried calling the local shelter. Jim asked the shelter if they had a bed he could sleep in, but the shelter did not have a bed for him. So now we've illustrated that this is a situation someone might run into where they can't get a bed at a homeless shelter. There's also a reminder in here about what homeless means in case people have forgotten the vocab term. So when we say Jim is homeless, he does not know where he can sleep tonight. We've reminded them what it means. All right, let's do our activity for using examples. So what we've written in second person is you might want to contact your elected officials about an important issue. You could call the office of your elected official and tell them how you feel about the issue. What are some ways we might make that into a third person example with a little more detail and specificity? Gail says, give the main character a name. So talk about a specific person doing this. Eliana says, Joe can contact his elected officials. He can call them when there is an important issue. Marissa says, give an example of an issue. So talk about something specific that someone is contacting elected officials about. These are all great suggestions. So what we did was turn, you might want to contact your elected officials about an important issue into Congress is going to vote on a bill about getting rid of all the sidewalks. Kristen thinks it is a bad idea to get rid of all the sidewalks. Kristen decides to call her members of Congress to tell them what she thinks. Kristen calls the office and tells them that she uses the sidewalk to get around every day. She tells them that getting rid of the sidewalks would mean she has to walk in the street, which would be dangerous. Kristen asks her member of Congress to vote no on the bill. So by giving the definition in this more detailed way, we've, oh, I clicked away from it. There we go. We've added some context to these steps. We've shown like in order what you do when you contact an elected official. You call, you tell them what you think, you give them the reasons why, and then you have your ask, in this case, to vote no on a bill. Susan Marie in the chat asked, would bill and Congress need explaining? That's a great point. And ideally, in a plain language document, you would only want to give a definition in this way if you had already defined the terms bill and Congress. If you hadn't, then you might want to put a little explainer above that saying what Congress is and what a law or bill is. All right, our next guideline is avoiding unnecessary information. So you want to leave out information when you're writing in plain language that isn't needed to explain your main points. The reason is that unnecessary information distracts the reader from the main points that are in your writing. And it can make it hard for people to keep track of what you do want them to focus on. So think of it like your reader is spending energy to learn every new thing that you put in the document. And if you overload them by asking them to spend energy on too many things, it can make it harder for them to keep track of everything that you've put in and retain all that information that you've kind of loaded in that document. So you want to be really analyzing, is it necessary to say this or that? And it often is necessary to say a lot of things. So I'm not saying like just hack away, but you want to be intentional about what you leave in and what you take out. Tips for avoiding unnecessary information: figure out what your main points are. What's the main point of the sentence? What's the main point of this paragraph? And then think about all of the different pieces of information that you're including. And for each one, ask, is this necessary to make the main point clearer? Here's an example of avoiding unnecessary information. We start with the sentence, the people of Chicago are used to wearing many layers because temperatures during the winter months can drop extremely low. Let's say we're just trying to talk about the weather in Chicago. In that case, it would be much better to just say it gets very cold in Chicago during the winter. The exception to this would be if we're trying to talk about how people dress in Chicago. If we're doing that, then we might want to keep in all the information that's in the first sentence. But if we're just talking about the weather, then we can take out how people dress because it's not necessary to tell people that in order for them to understand that it's cold. All right, let's try avoiding unnecessary information in this activity. Here we have written, there are lots of good things about having a pet dog. Dogs can make you happier. Dogs can help you be more active. Dogs can alert you to danger. Some people prefer cats to dogs. There are also good things about cats. So can some folks tell me what is the main point of this paragraph and what would they take out that is unnecessary, if anything? Jordan says the main point is benefits of having a dog. Michelle says what we would take out is references to cats. And I'm seeing several people saying the same thing. Yes, that is in fact what we did. Because the main point of this paragraph is what are the good things about having a pet dog? We took out the sentences about cats because that wasn't necessary to illustrate the main point. All right, let's talk about using clear language. Basically, when you use words that refer to a larger thing, so saying like this, they, or it, you want to make sure it's clear what you're referring to. And if it's not clear, it might be better to say the subject again or to divide the sentence into two sentences, just to make sure that people can keep track of what you're talking about. The reason is if it's difficult to keep track of what's going on in the text, that's going to confuse your reader. And if there's like ambiguity, that can make it harder for them to follow what you're saying. I'll give an example because this can be sound kind of abstract until I give this example. The example here is if you say Sarah works at a grocery store and this is how she makes money. Instead, you could say Sarah works at a grocery store. Sarah makes money by working at the grocery store. So tips for doing this. When you use a pronoun, check if it could refer to multiple subjects. And then make sure you always clearly mention a subject before using a pronoun to refer to that subject later. Looking at this activity now, I think this will really illustrate the ways that these words can get complicated and obscure, like who's being referred to or what's being referred to. So what we've written here is Charlie is interviewing for a job at Big Company Incorporated. The interview is with Bob and Alice. They ask them if they have any questions about their mission statement. So all of these theys and thems in the last sentence could refer to Charlie, they could refer to Big Company Inc., or they could refer to Bob and Alice. And that's a little confusing because you don't know who's being referred to by what pronoun. So what are some ways we could make this clearer and like phrase it so we understand who's doing what in this situation? We could say, Jordan says we could say Bob and Alice ask Charlie. That would definitely help. Gail says use their names instead of saying them. That's essentially it. We also can refer to the company when we're talking about the company. Susan Marie says, are Bob and Alice's names important info? That's interesting. And then Hannah says, Big Company Inc.'s mission statement instead of saying their mission statement. So those are all right on. The way we've rewritten this is Bob and Alice ask Charlie if Charlie has any questions about Big Company Inc.'s mission statement. So let's talk about using straightforward language. In plain language, most of the time you want to avoid figures of speech like metaphors, sarcasm, and idioms. The reason is that readers may not always understand metaphors, sarcasm, and other figures of speech. Avoiding these ways of writing can make the document more accessible. So some tips for doing this. If you look at a sentence and you read it literally, figure out if there are ways that your language could be misunderstood if people were to take what you say at face value. For example, let's look at the sentence, the building was like a mountain towering over the city. That's probably meant to indicate that the building is very tall. But if you don't totally like intuitively guess that that's what the sentence is saying, you might think it's saying that the building was like a mountain in other ways, like it's the shape of a mountain, or it has snow on it, or it's made of rocks. So here's some examples of using straightforward language. Instead of saying it was the last thing he wanted, we could say he really didn't want it. Or instead of saying some people with ADHD say their brains are like wild horses, we could say some people with ADHD say their brains are tough to control. If for some reason you felt like a metaphor is really important and you need to leave it in, what I would do is say it and then explain what it means. So for example, you could say something like, some people with ADHD say their brains are like wild horses. What they mean by that is that their brains are tough to control. All right, let's look at an activity. So here we have written, Rashida was as stressed as a snowman in the Sahara. She was inches away from a work deadline and realized she'd been barking up the wrong tree about a problem in one of her projects. Rashida already felt adrift in a sea of work, and now she'd have to go back to the drawing board. So can anyone point out what are some figures of speech, idioms, metaphors in this little passage, and what could we replace them with that would be easier to understand? Jordan says, get rid of snowman in the Sahara, just say stressed. Maria says the same thing. Dawn says, say start over instead of back to the drawing board. Daniela says, barking up the wrong tree, we should get rid of. Jordan says, say she was close to a deadline instead of saying she was inches away from the deadline. Hannah says, lots of figures of speech change the whole thing. Yes. All right. So what we ended up doing was we rewrote this as Rashida was extremely stressed. She had a work deadline coming up and realized she'd been looking in the wrong place for solutions to a problem she had. Rashida already felt overwhelmed by the work she had to do. Now she'd have to start all over trying to solve the problem she'd been having. All right, this is the last principle we're going to go over today. Let's talk about using active voice. So what we want to do is avoid passive voice. Passive voice is where the subject of the sentence is receiving the action that's being done in the sentence. So instead of saying, I threw the ball, passive voice would be saying, the ball was thrown by me. Active voice would be saying, I flew to LA, and then passive voice would be LA was arrived at by me. So you can see in these examples that passive voice can often be a little more convoluted, but even when it seems simple, it can still be easier to understand active voice than passive voice. Here's an example of active voice and passive voice. Passive is the bill will be read by Congress, and active is Congress will read the bill. All right, how do you know if you're writing an active voice or passive voice? My favorite way is to use the zombie test. The first thing you do in the zombie test is you identify the main verb of the sentence and you end the sentence at that verb. So this sentence says the bill will be read by Congress. Read is the main verb, and we're going to end the sentence there. The bill will be read. Then we're going to add zombies. So we add the words by zombies. The bill will be read by zombies. That makes sense. I mean, it's weird to think about zombies reading a bill, but grammatically it works. So if you can add the words by zombies and grammatically the sentence still makes sense, that means it's in passive voice. Alternately, let's look at this sentence. Congress will read the bill. The main verb is again read. We're going to cut it off there. Congress will read. Now we're going to add the zombies. Congress will read by zombies. That does not make sense. That means it's an active voice. So the guideline here is if there is room for the zombies, the sentence is in passive voice, and you should try to get it to be an active voice instead. All right, let's do an activity. Here we have written, my first trip out of the country will always be remembered. Many memories were made. Next summer, a trip will be taken again. I hope that interesting sights will be seen. Does anyone want to point out any passive voice going on in this passage and maybe what we could say instead? Maria says, instead of saying my first trip out of the country will always be remembered, say I will always remember my first trip out of the country. Jordan says, I made many memories instead of saying many memories were made. Marissa says, instead of saying many interesting sights will be seen, you could say, I hope that I will see interesting sights. Jordan says, instead of saying a trip will be taken again, you could say, I will take a trip again next summer. Yes, all right, we've now gone through all the sentences and identified the passive voice. Okay, so those are the main principles of plain language that I wanted to go over today. Now let's talk briefly about translating into plain language. So you might be writing a plain language document from scratch, but it's often the case that you already have a document and you want to create a plain language version of something that already exists, and maybe something that's already been published and is already out there accessible to people. Let's give an overview of this. The important thing is that plain language must have the same information as the original source. I want to make a new outline. You're going to think about defining terms versus replacing them, and then you will check your reading level. So I will talk about all of these things now. Plain language must have the same information as the original source. It is okay to add additional information that like clarifies information in the original source. For example, your original source might not define terms and you're going to add definitions. That's fine. The point is, you don't want to be taking out information from your original source so that the plain language version ends up with less information than the original source. The exception to this is if you haven't published your original source yet, and you're like, oh, I think this is extraneous information, I'm going to take it out of both versions. That's fine. But if you've already published your original source, then you don't want to take out information from the plain language version, because then you won't be giving your reader equal access to what's in the other document. So two versions of a document, think of it like if you're translating a document into a different language, you shouldn't take information out. The translation, if something is being presented as like, this is a translation of that, you assume that they have the same information in them. It's the same with a plain language translation. You're going to assume it has the same information in it. Otherwise, it's just a summary, which is a different thing. So starting by making a new outline. Starting with a complex document means you're going to need to break it down into smaller parts. A way to do this is to write a new outline that condenses the information in your original document into the main ideas. When you have that outline, it can help you look at different things. So you can look at where is there gaps in the information. And you can also look at, maybe it would help to move information around. So present it in a different order. And it may be, for example, that some of what would be more introductory level content, if you have to explain it, you've put at the end of your original document. But to understand this, you need to understand that. So that should come first. So we're going to put that first and then add an explanation and then go back to the other content that came first in the original document. So like adding stuff, moving stuff around, all of that is totally fine and good. Let's talk about defining terms versus replacing terms. I spoke a little bit earlier when we were talking about jargon about how sometimes you're going to need to keep complicated terms in your plain language writing. And that also goes for when you're translating from a complicated document into a plain language document. For example, let's say you're talking about housing policy. You might decide to keep in the term affordable housing because it's so commonly used in talking about housing policy that even though the word affordable is not very accessible, it still makes sense to leave it in so that people will know what others are talking about when they hear the phrase affordable housing in these conversations. If a term is less common or you don't really need it in order to understand conversations about a topic, then you could take it out and replace it with something else. For example, we had a document on natural disasters. The term emergency management was coming up a lot, but we felt that that could easily be reworded to dealing with an emergency. And then we defined the word emergency. So the emergency as a vocab term needs to stay in, but the phrase emergency management didn't. When you keep complex terms, ASIN likes to have a words to know section, which is what we call a glossary. That has all the important terms from the document put together. This is just an example of a words to know section from our resource on the federal budget. Mary says, do you have a recommendation for the average number of letters in words that are accessible or a maximum number of letters? So I would say it's not so much about how many letters are in a word as about how many syllables and how common it is. And these are things that a reading level checker can help you with. Hannah asks also, is there a preferred reading grade level? We are going to get into that. For plain language, we go 5th to 7th or lower generally. For easy read, which is another cognitively accessible format, we go 3rd to 4th or lower. Jordan says, should terms be defined both in a glossary and in the text itself? Yes, that's what ASIN does. We find it's best practice to have both. We put the glossary before the document so that people can learn the vocab terms before they read the document, but it's a lot to get in your head all at once, and you're not in all of the information in the glossary if you don't know it going in. So we redefine everything again in the text, in the body text of the document. Any other questions before we move on from defining and replacing? All right, let's talk about reading level. So a reading level is about how easy it is to read a piece of text. Reading levels are like calculated by mathematical formulas. And these formulas take into account things like how difficult or unusual is a word, what is the length of the sentence and paragraph, how is the sentence structured, and other stuff. And it varies by formula. So there are many readability formulas and they all are done slightly differently. Plain language documents, like I said earlier, should be 5th to 8th grade reading level or lower. Nothing wrong with going lower. In many cases, the lower you can get, the better. There are a lot of websites that check your reading level. We use Hemingway and Readable. There's also Automatic Readability Checker, which is free, unlike these other tools. So feel free to use them all. All reading level checkers score reading level using a group of scales. So basically, like I said, there are many different readability formulas, and they're going to give you slightly different scores. Or maybe wildly different scores, depending on what they are using to calculate the formula and how your text is. So what we do is kind of try and average out those scores as your overall reading level. And then a good readability checker will also like flag for you problems that they find in the document. So it might say like, this word is too long, this word is too uncommon, this sentence is too long, you used passive voice here. Sometimes readability checkers will flag things that don't matter. For example, Readable will flag when you put in adverbs and say it's a problem that there's an adverb here. We've never found that our readers have a problem with adverbs, so we generally ignore that. But often these flags that they give you will be a good time to like look at, oh, should I shorten this sentence? Should I change this word to something else? Sandra asks, can you give us a link for a good reading level checker? I'm just going to go back a bit. Hemingway and readable are two. There's also automatic readability checker. I can try and get those in the chat when I'm done presenting. I can't go on the internet now because I'm sharing my screen. But I will try and look those up later. So this is just showing you what it looks like to use readable. I've taken approximately what I just said and popped it in this reading level checker. You can see it's given me a grade of B for overall readability. On the right, you can see all the different scales, how they've scored what I said. And then you can see in the body of the text, some sentences are highlighted. The ones in yellow they think are too long, and the one in red they think is way too long. This is the same text analyzed in Hemingway. Hemingway has also pointed out places where they think a phrase has like simpler alternatives. So for example, we have the phrase all of here. I could have just said of instead of saying all of. So it's going to flag that for me as well. Question in the chat. Hannah says, will these tools identify words that may not be as easily understood, for example, scales? A reading level checker generally won't flag for you all of the words that need definitions. That's fairly subjective. And also, even though reading levels are often making calculations based on how common a word is, they don't tend to like show that in the document. So it won't tell you like how common is this word, how common is that word. So that is a judgment call you're going to have to make yourself. Daniela says, would you say these tools are better than Grammarly? Because when I'm trying to check the reading level, that's all I'm trying to do. I don't use Grammarly because it does a bunch of different stuff that I don't need. So I don't know how. I'm sure Grammarly also has reading level checker, but I don't know how it compares to these. All right. We have come to our last thing before I open it up to questions, which is a rewrite activity. So here we have written, as more autistic individuals enter higher education across the United States, college campuses have begun to explore how to best facilitate the success of these students. Many campuses have created support programs specifically for autistic students. However, there are no universal standards for what kinds of support these programs should provide. Altogether, this reads at a 13.5 or college reading level. So can folks identify anything here that should be changed? Words that should be swapped out, sentences that should be shortened, ways that we can break a longer sentence down into shorter sentences? Is there any passive voice? Do folks see anything like that? And I will be looking for answers in the chat. Susan Marie says break first sentence at the comma. That would be a great start. Susan Marie says, say college, not higher education. Julia says, define higher education. So either of those could definitely work. Marissa says, explain what a universal standard is, or rephrase the term universal standard to mean something else. Gail says, change the word individuals to another word. You're right, individuals is needlessly long and unusual. Jordan says, facilitate success can be changed to help these students succeed. Susan Marie says, instead of have begun to explore, say are learning to or are trying to. And then we've got Maria and Hannah suggesting some rewrites. So these are all great suggestions. I'll just give an example of how you could rewrite this to get it to a lower reading level. Here up top is the original paragraph, and then below we have rewritten it as the number of autistic people going to college is going up. Colleges have started thinking about how to help these students succeed. Many colleges have made support programs for autistic students. These programs give different kinds of support. Some programs don't give the same kinds of support as other programs do. The colleges don't all agree on what kind of support is best. So we needed more sentences, but they are shorter sentences using more common words, and we've gotten down to a 5.9 grade level. which is good enough for plain language, but not low enough for easy reads. So I didn't have time to get into easy read here, but it is a lower reading level of format that's picture assisted. All right. That is what I was hoping to go over today. I'm happy to open it up for questions. I'm going to end my screen sharing. How can I do that? There, with that button, I can do that. So I can see the chat better. Christine says, can you send the links to Hemingway app and Readable app? Someone actually posted those in the chat up top. So those were posted already. Many people saying good information. Thank you so much. Jordan says, where did these suggestions come from? So this is from ASN developed this training for a series of trainings that we put on accessible formats. And where this comes from is, like the principles of plain language and our experience trying to write plain language content and trying to take content that is more academic and simplify it to the point where it's understood by more people. Many questions here. I'm going to scroll up. Daniela says, I'm a bit new to the concept of reading level. Could you briefly explain it? Sure. So a reading level is a number that you get that sort of tells you how easy or difficult your writing is to read. It's given as a grade number. So like it will say this is written at a 6th grade reading level. This is written at a 3rd grade reading level. I don't love that because it makes it sound like a lower reading level is for kids and a higher reading level is for adults. Really, the general public reads at an 8th grade reading level or lower. So writing at a lower reading level is not just for kids, it's for the general public. And reading levels are calculated using mathematical formulas. Each formula is different and there are many of them, but they take into account stuff like sentences, words per sentence, syllables per word, how common or uncommon the words that you're using are, whether you're using passive voice, stuff like that. So that's my brief explanation of reading levels. I hope that was helpful. Dawn says, does ASN have recommendations for academics to always include plain language information about research publications that are disability related? Yes, ideally, you'd want to create a plain language version of, for example, a paper or an abstract or a call for proposals or something like recruiting participants. You'd want plain language versions of all of those so that people with disabilities can not only get involved in disability research, but can also understand the research in its final published form. Some people have done things like make plain language abstracts, even if they can't, if they don't have, for example, the funding or the time to make a plain language version of the whole paper. That's definitely a step in the right direction, and I do encourage that. Terry says, have you used ChatGPT to make plain language? I would really not encourage you to do this. There are some AI tools that will alter the reading level of a document. However, AI is a machine. It doesn't understand what you're trying to say. So it will change what you're saying. You'll take something with a higher reading level and give you something with a lower reading level, but the information may not be the same between those two things because the AI doesn't understand the content. It's just like doing it mechanically. It's doing it based on word prediction and other things like that. I have seen people try to use AI to make plain language products. I have seen it go really, really wrong. I've seen misinformation in documents because of this. I've seen policy concepts explained that were just incorrectly done because people used AI to make a plain language product. So I really wouldn't recommend you do that, at least not until the tools get much better. Susan Marie says, would it be a good practice to make a plain language version of the syllabus available to students? We often design syllabuses for class, syllabi for class without knowing who students are. I think that would be great. I think definitely if you're teaching a whole class, it may be difficult to, for example, give all the readings in plain language, but having a syllabus in plain language would give people a place to start. And then if someone needs more plain language content, that's something they could maybe talk to disability services about, get more assistance with. But it would be great to have things like, what's your late policy? What is your DEI policy, all of those things that people need to know about your class available in plain language. I think that would be helpful. Gail says, I noticed that one of your PL examples use contractions like don't and I'm in formal writing that is not common or recommended. Is that common or accepted in plain language? So I've seen people do this both ways. There are some people that say you can and should use contractions because it makes the sentence shorter and fewer words per sentence is more accessible. And there are some people that say it's less accessible to use contractions because someone has to do the mental work of like translating what the contraction means. And that is more difficult. So I'm going to refer to this one as a judgment call. ASAN often doesn't use contractions in our plain language stuff, but occasionally we will. Yeah, I think this one is a judgment call, basically. Elaine says, are publishers moving in the direction of publishing both original and plain language manuscripts? Some people are. I'm seeing this mostly in disability spaces where people will put out, for example, a white paper, and the white paper will have a plain language version or a plain language summary. I'm not seeing this a lot in spaces outside of like disability specific nonprofits or research or other projects that have to do with disability, but would love to. I would really encourage more people to do this. Brooke says, the term developmental disability gets flagged in readability. Do you suggest defining it all the time when you need to use it frequently? So when at ASAN, when we're writing for an audience of people with disabilities, we don't define the term disability. We assume our audience already knows it. But a term like developmental disability, which is more complicated and less frequently used, we will define the first time we use it in a document. Like I said, when you're defining a document, you don't have to answer it. You don't have to, sorry. I was looking at the thing and got confused. When you're defining a term in a document, you don't have to put the definition with the term every time you use the term. Although if there is a long break between uses of the term, you might want to add in a reminder. Jordan says, I want to cite these guidelines. Where can I find the original source? You can cite a webinar, and that's what I would do in this case, because ASAN hasn't published these guidelines in a publication on our website. So I would cite this webinar. And it's going to be available on AARP's website, which Ben linked at the beginning of the presentation.
Awesome.
All right,
Do we have any other questions? Anything at all? We still have 7 minutes still. Going once, going twice. Great. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I thought this was a really informative webinar. I really enjoyed listening to Zoe. Zoe, thank you for presenting. Clear and concise, definitely clear and concise. As she mentioned, as I had posted before, I'll post it again in the chat. The webinar has been recorded. It will be available on the website. So it's not available quite yet at the link, but it'll be available by the end of the day. And then the other thing I wanted to put in the chat was the feedback survey. These surveys are really important. They help us give you the speakers and the topics that you want to hear about. So please take the 5 minutes to fill that out if you have the availability. It would really help us. But otherwise, thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And we'll see you on May 21st, which is the next ARP webinar, the topic and speaker TBD. So thank you all.
Thank you for having me.
Great, sounds good.